So until now, we have always assumed that everything went well with our AJAX calls. So we never handled any errors. However, an important part of web development is to actually handle errors, because it's very common that errors happen in web applications. And so in this lecture, let's talk about how to handle errors in promises. And to start, remember that a promise in which an error happened is a rejected promise. And so in this video, we're going to learn how to handle promise rejections. Now, actually, the only way in which the fetch promise rejects is when the user loses his internet connection. And so for now, that's going to be the only error that we will handle here. Now, to simulate losing the internet connection, we can go here to network, and then we can basically change the speed here to offline. However, when we then reload the page, then basically everything will disappear. And so that's not really what we want. We want to simulate that the page was first still loaded, but then as the user does the request without internet, then we want to see the error happening. And so let's set it back to online. And so now what we want to do is to basically only call this function here whenever the user clicks on a button. And so that will then make it easier for us to simulate losing the internet connection. So here in the HTML, we already have a button. So let's comment this one out. And then in the script, I believe, so I already have it here selected as this btn. And so all we will do now is btn.add-event-listener, click, and then here function, and just like this. All right. So just to see what happens here. So indeed, that works just fine. But now watch what happens when we set ourselves offline. Let's go back to the console. And so now when we do the request, then we get these errors here. So first, this one here. But the one that's most important is that we now have an on-caught promise. And so, because we have failed to fetch. And so at this point, for the first time, the promise that's returned from the fetch function was actually rejected. And so let's now handle that rejection. Now there are two ways of handling rejections. And the first one is to pass a second callback function into the then method. So the first callback function here is always going to be called for the fulfilled promise, so for a successful one. But we can also pass in a second callback, which will be called when the promise was rejected. So let's do that. And this callback function will be called with an argument, which is basically the error itself. And so let's simply alert the error. All right. So let's try that. Oh, and now we are back to having no internet. So we first need to do everything normally. So load the page. Now we lose the connection. And now we do the request. And so now actually we handled the error by displaying this alert window. And the error that we saw previously down here is now gone. So now, in fact, we no longer have this uncaught error down here because we did actually catch the error right here. So handling the error is also called catching the error. And so again, that's the reason why this error that we had here before disappeared. So it said uncaught error, but again, now we are actually catching it here. And so with this, we are now handling the error that might occur in this promise here. Okay. Now in this case, there are then no more errors because basically the chain stops here when this error happens and when it's handled right here. But now what if there was actually no error in this fetch promise here? So basically, what if this fetch promise was actually fulfilled, but then the second one here was rejected. Well, then we would also have to catch an error here. So we would have to come here, get this function and paste it here, and also handle the error right here. However, that is a little bit annoying, and so in fact there is a better way of basically handling all these errors globally just in one central place. So instead of all of these callback functions here, let's just delete them. Okay, so this is a lot nicer just having one callback in the den. And then instead, we can handle all the errors no matter where they appear in the chain right at the end of the chain by adding a catch method. And then here we can actually use the same callback function, because the callback function here will also be called with the error object that occurred, and so then we can handle it in some way. All right, so again, this catch method here at the end of the chain will basically catch any errors that occur in any place in this whole promise chain, and no matter where that is. So errors basically propagate down the chain until they are caught. And only if they're not caught anywhere, then we get that uncaught error that we saw right in the beginning. All right, so let's now try this again, and we will have to put back the internet, reload the page, get back offline, and indeed, we get the same error now here. So the same alert window that we had before. Now instead of having that annoying alert window, let's just log the error to the console and create some string here. So error, and then let's just add some emojis so that we know exactly which errors were printed by ourselves. Well, let's add a couple of them here. And in fact, we can actually also style this one with console.error. Remember? I think I showed you this one at some point in the beginning of the course. But anyway, usually simply logging the error to the console is not enough in a real application with a real user interface. And so instead of just logging something to the console, let's also display an error message for the user to see. And so that's then a more real use case of this catch block. All right. So I'm adding a new block here. So we still want to, of course, log the error to the console. But besides that, let's actually now create a function that will also render some kind of error. Okay. So let's do that outside here. And I'm calling it render error. So this is a function, and it can take in a message. Just call it like this. And just like the country elements, we want to attach this to country's container and then insert adjacent. And this time not HTML, but insert adjacent text. So this is a new one, but basically it does the same thing as insert adjacent HTML, but simply with text. So it doesn't create any new HTML elements. Okay, and then besides that, remember, we always have to set the opacity back to 1. So just as we did before in the render countries function, because otherwise this container is not even going to be visible. And actually, let's put this function right at the very top of the file together with the render country function. So just like this. Okay, so again, in both cases, in order to actually see the container, we set the opacity to 1. Okay, and so now here, let's use that. Render, so not country, of course, error. Let's say something went wrong. Then here we can use our emoji again. Why not? And then here, let's again print the error. And actually, this error that is generated here is a real JavaScript object. So we can create errors in JavaScript with a constructor, for example, just like a map or a set. And any error in JavaScript that was created like this contains the message property. So we can use that here to basically only print the message of that error and not the whole object itself. And we will actually learn more about the built-in error object of JavaScript in the next video. Now to try this, we need to again get ourselves online. Then offline, check the console. And indeed, we get our custom error down here, visible by the emojis, and then our own message here for the user. Now it's not super pretty, but that's not the point here. And as you see, indeed, this here is simply the error.message, while down here we have the entire error. So that includes the type error, and even it includes this so-called stack trace. So it shows us exactly where the error comes from. All right, and so that's how we handle errors happening in promises in any then handler. So basically handling any promise rejection no matter where it happens in the chain. Now just to finish, there is one more quick method that I want to show you, and that is also available on all promises. So besides then and catch, there's also the finally method. So let's add a finally here. Finally, and then the callback function that we define here will always be called whatever happens with the promise. So no matter if the promise is fulfilled or rejected, this callback function that we define here is going to be called always. So that's the difference between the other two. So the then method is only called when the promise is fulfilled, while this one is only called while the promise is rejected. Now the finally method is not always useful, but sometimes it actually is. So we use this method for something that always needs to happen no matter the result of the promise. And one good example of that is to hide a loading spinner, like these rotating circles that you see everywhere in web applications when you load some data. So these applications show a spinner when an asynchronous operation starts and then hide it once the operation completes. And that happens no matter if the operation was successfully or not. And so for that, the finally method is perfect. And in our case, what we always need to do is to fade in the container. So basically, this part here always happens no matter what, right? So no matter if we render the country in the case of success, or if we render the error in case of an error, no matter what, we always need to do this. And so let's take this out of here. So I'm copying it here and deactivating this in both cases. And then let's put it here into the finally handler. Okay. And now we no longer need the offline. So let's just reload, put it here. And yeah, that works beautifully. Just notice that this actually works because catch itself also returns a promise. So that's the only way why this here can work. So of course, this only works on promises. And so, yeah, again, this can only work if catch itself also returns a promise. All right. Now let's try to simulate another error so that I can show you what we need to do next. So let's say that we're trying to search for a country that simply doesn't exist. And so our API is not going to find any result for that. Let's say just this. So let's see. And well, we get this weird error that we cannot read property flag of undefined in line 152. No, so basically it's coming from this place. But of course, then in our stack trace, we can see where exactly it's coming from. So it's coming from get country data. Well, in this case, it's not that helpful, but sometimes inspecting this stack trace can be helpful indeed. So anyway, this error here is weird, and it doesn't really reflect the true error, which is simply that our API cannot find any country with this name. So the true error is of course not that we cannot read flag of undefined, but in fact it is that our API cannot find any country. And so that's reflected here with the status code of 404. However, as I said in the beginning, the fetch promise only rejects when there is no internet connection. But with a 404 error like this, which is not a real error, but, well, it kind of is. But anyway, with this 404, the fetch promise will still get fulfilled. So there is no rejection, and so our catch handler cannot pick up on this error. It does pick up on this other error, so this one here, but that's not the one that we actually want to handle. In this case, we really want to tell the user that no country was found with this name. And so that is what we will do in the next lecture, so that this one doesn't become all too long.